Thanks everyone for staying. I know lunch is right after this, so I'll be brief. My project is called Priya Shakti. It's an interactive augmented reality comic book that deals with gender violence. But you can use the format of comic books or AR to pretty much tackle any issue. And I'm going to hopefully through this presentation give you some ideas, and also motivate you to tackle gender violence or other issues that you're influenced by. So I'm going to start with a little trailer.
Priya Shakti is an innovative multimedia project that addresses attitudes towards gender-based violence in India and around the world. Hindu gods and their moral tales are integral to the Hindu majority in India and the Indian diasporas. Priya Shakti provides a new narrative and voice in the mythological canon by placing the goddess Parvati, an immortal woman who is a rape survivor, at the center of the story. Central to Priya Shakti is an augmented reality comic book, which uses a popular app to make animation, videos, and other interactive elements pop out of its pages. In our comic book, certain panels are animated featuring real-life stories and voices of Indian women who have survived sexual assault and face the ensuing trauma and social stigma. These pieces are short documentaries, but the women are animated in order to protect their identity. The comic book is available as a print and digital version and free to download worldwide at priyashakti.com.
So I'm not a coder or even a comic book artist. I'm actually a documentary filmmaker. And this project started for me back in December 2012. How many of you remember there was this horrible gang rape that happened on a bus in Delhi, which got worldwide news everywhere? Well, I was in Delhi at that time, and I was involved in the protests that soon followed in response to the indifference the government showed to the victim and then who eventually passed away. At one of those protests, I spoke to a Delhi police officer and asked him what he thought about what happened to her, and more particular, what was happening around him. And he said something that really got me started on this entire project. He said, "No good girl walks home alone at night. No good girl walks home alone at night," implying that she either deserved it or she provoked the rape. So I knew immediately at that point that the problem of gender-based violence in India and probably all over the world was not a legal problem, but a cultural problem. So this began my one-year journey in trying to understand gender-based violence because I was completely new to this topic. So within that year, I traveled all over India and Southeast Asia, talking with poets, philosophers, people in NGOs working with gender-based violence issues, and then eventually with gang rape survivors in northern Delhi, outside of Delhi. And what they told me got me deeply thinking about how to really address this and how to have social impact. And I'll just recount one of the stories which will give you an idea of the problem of patriarchy in India and in many other countries. One of the survivors told me that when she was gang raped by a group of men who videographed the rape on their phones and threatened her that if she ever went public, they would release the video to their family and then put it on the web. So that night she went home, took a shower, burned her clothes, and never told anyone and never got any medical help. She lived with this trauma for an entire week, and it was only when this same group of men raped another woman in a neighboring village that she went public and decided to seek legal recourse. And it was a long ordeal. It took her many years. And throughout that whole ordeal, it was very traumatic. The shame was always put on her. Her family was ostracized. And eventually her father committed suicide from the shame that he was experiencing. Now, she eventually did get justice, and she put those men away in jail. But I began wondering when I was talking to her, if this is the ordeal that rape survivors have to go through in order to get justice, what incentive is it for them to seek legal recourse? You know, just imagine going, and when I was interviewing her, this was a few years after she got justice, she was still being guarded by a police officer carrying a semi-automatic machine gun. Because whenever she went back to her village, she needed protection. Now, just imagine going to the prom or going out on a date and you're being followed by a cop with a semi-automatic machine gun. You can never live a normal life. And this is this sort of the problem of patriarchy and the problem that rape not only has on the survivors, but how society treats them affects how they deal with it. So this led to the idea of creating an Indian female superhero whose name is Priya, who is also a rape survivor. And she would be the symbol or the power in which to challenge patriarchy. Originally, she calls upon the gods, the Hindu gods, for help, but they become more problems than help. And she eventually realized it's really up to her to change and to challenge people's perceptions towards rape and towards rape survivors. And the goal, and really what was really critical, was we tried to understand who the audience for this whole project was. And in fact, I did a lot of field testing, and I field tested this whole comic book with teenagers, and they helped develop the story and gave response to the character and the artwork, and eventually the AR, which I'll talk about shortly. And it was very critical that we focused on one particular demographic, which was teenage boys in India. Because teenage boys at that particular time in their life are going through dramatic changes. They're understanding gender, they're understanding sexuality, they're understanding relationships. So I'll talk a little bit about the AR, and I'll eventually get to how we release this comic book. So one of the really critical components of this project, remember this was December 2013, this was in 2013 that I was working on this project. So AR was really in its infinite stage. And I developed this idea of AR when I was visiting the Sistine Chapel in Rome. And I remember looking at Michelangelo's artwork and saying, this is the greatest comic book ever drawn, the comic book of life. And each panel, if you've ever been there, is really high up in the air, really difficult to see. And I wanted to figure out a way to scan those panels to learn about what was happening in each story. And that's sort of where the idea of AR came. And literally, I emailed this company called Blipar. I sent it to like info@blipar.com, and they're one of the biggest AR companies out there. It's like sending an email to info@Microsoft and getting product service or whatever. And surprisingly, they emailed me back, and they loved this idea, and they came on board as our partners and gave us the whole platform and free services in developing the AR for the comic book. And this was a recent article in Fast Company about our use of AR, which was very groundbreaking for India because they were just starting up in India at that time. And so we launched the comic book in December 2014 at the Mumbai Comic Con, which is hundreds of thousands of teenagers go there. And again, those were our audience, male teenage boys. And we gave out free comic books, and immediately the comic book and the whole project became viral, became a global hit. Up to date, we had over 500 news stories written about the comic book worldwide, and about 500,000 downloads, and over 26 million views of the comic book worldwide. Right after we launched in December 2014, the UN honored the whole project and our main character as a gender equality champion. She was recognized even before Wonder Woman was honored by the UN. Now, one of the really amazing things about this thing is, which I discovered organically while developing it, is augmented reality street art. Now, I really want to emphasize this. AR is incredibly cheap to do. Like, this project is so cheap, and creating street art was incredibly cheap. And all of these murals and street arts that we've put up in India are seen by millions and millions of people every year. I mean, these 20, 30, 100,000 people walk by these murals every day. So I'm going to show a little video, and I'll sort of explain the meaning behind this. I'm just running out of time. So the whole purpose of this project is to create empathy and understanding for rape survivors. So the image of Priya, who's a rape survivor, on these murals, whenever people walk by them, they always say, that's a strong, empowered woman, which is what we're trying to emphasize. We just released the second chapter of the comic book, which I have a few here, which deals with acid attack survivors. And the comic book was created and developed with acid attack survivors in the US, in Colombia, and in India. And we launched it at a cafe run by acid attack survivors. And one of them came up to me afterwards and said, she started crying. She said, I've never seen myself as a hero. Everyone in India always looked at me as a villain, because that's what acid attack survivors are often portrayed in pop culture. And she was very moved by this whole project. And then the second one, which we released, was funded by the World Bank. So thank you. Thanks for everyone for coming, and hopefully I'll see you around.